right. Episode 20 of the Zero Powerlifting Podcast. That's what we're up to right now. Today's one's probably going to be a quick one. We'll see. We're about to find out. But I'm going to talk to you about cutting weight for competitions. And I don't mean just generally. I mean like a water cut that you do in the last week leading into the competition to make weight for the competition. I'm not going to do a full-on breakdown, but hopefully provide some insight into how it works, and hopefully, demystify the subject. I say that word too much these days. Hopefully demystify the subject and provide a little bit of hopefully guidance to help you make the right decision next time you do a cut for a comp. So I guess the best place to start this is determining whether it's worth doing a cut, and determining also whether you should be doing the cut. So if it's worth it and if you should be doing it. So is it worth it? I mean, ultimately this is going to come between the athlete and the coach, or the athlete themselves if they're without a coach or they're self-coached. And everyone's going to have different ideas as to what's worth cutting for and what's not. It also comes down to the degree of the cut, as in how much weight you're actually trying to cut. But in general, unless there is a real need to be in a particular weight class, that is, you're not chasing a record, you are chasing a record, you have to be that weight class because that's what you've qualified for nationals, you have to be that weight class because that's what you need to be to qualify for a bigger comp, whatever it may be. If none of that's really on the line, if you can qualify in any weight class and that you just need to put up a total, then you can nominate your weight class for the bigger comp, or you're not chasing any records, there's not particularly any competition in that weight class that you're chasing or you need to be up against, it's probably not worth doing the cut. And a lot of lifters will become very, very, very emotionally attached to a particular number, a particular weight class. They'll identify as a 90 kilo lifter or a 67.5 kilo lifter or a 63 kilo lifter, whatever it may be. They'll identify as this particular weight class, and they'll start to sacrifice strength and performance for the sake of being in that weight class. That's when you definitely need to start thinking about moving up. So the first step is you got to determine, is it worth you doing this cut? And the other thing you need to consider as well is, are you leaving it too late? So, you should be ready or within striking range of a reasonable water cut at least 3 months before your competition, 12 weeks-ish. It's a pretty arbitrary figure, but basically, in those last sort of 12 to 15 weeks is where the money training happens, where you need to be performing really well. I mean, you need to be performing well all the time, but the kind of loads that you're going to be lifting in the last 3 training blocks leading into your competition, you need to have your performance facilitated by enough food. And so what I'm saying is, by being in a calorie deficit in your strength phases and your peaking, you're going to be holding back your performance. If you're constantly holding back your performance, you're not going to do well at competitions. So you need to be within striking range of your weight class well in advance. And if you're not, that's on you. That's just poor preparation. And most people know what weight class they're going to be at or need to be at well in advance. So it's not an excuse to wait a couple of weeks before and then decide to cut calories. This is where a lot of lifters go wrong. They do things backwards, right? They go, okay, I've just competed. Now's the time where I can eat whatever I want and relax. And to some degree, that's true. But they'll stay in that mindset all the way up until they're ready to get serious for a comp again, 4 or 5 months out. Then they'll be like, okay, now I need to tighten things up. Should be the opposite. Because when you start to tighten things up leading into a comp, that's when you're going to start to restrict. You're going to start to pull back calorie intake. And this is the time where calorie intake should be at maintenance or maybe even a slight surplus to facilitate performance. You're not going to lift heavy weights well if you're in a calorie deficit. So you need to be prepared for your weight class well in advance. Anyway, let's talk about the actual process of cutting weight. Because people really mess this up because of bro science that's just perpetuated the industry. As a disclaimer, there are pretty serious risks that come with doing a water load and a water cut for a competition. You need to be well aware of the risks that you are putting your body or subjecting your body to. You need to be aware of what can happen if this is poorly managed, because it can be fatal. People die from cutting weight. Now, obviously, that's in very, 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 very extreme circumstances, but there are risks involved with the process of cutting weight, especially if done poorly, especially if done the bro science way. So I'm going to talk you through the way the science of the water cut works. I'm not going to go through exact protocols and everything because everyone's going to be a little bit different. The other thing to consider here, and the other thing that you need to wrap your head around, is how much is okay. It's going to be different for a 24-hour and a 2-hour weigh, and obviously the objective here is to manipulate your body weight without affecting performance and ideally without affecting calorie intake. So the process of water cutting is this playing with hydration, dehydration to manipulate the weight on the scales. That's as complex and as simple as it gets. And so in order to do this, we need to understand some basic things around how hydration works. Hydration is not just determined by the water you drink. And so that's an important thing to understand here, because a lot of people will dehydrate themselves as part of the water cutting process. Oh, hold up. I'll be done soon.
Is it chicken?
Yeah.
Okay,
Just all over the interruptions today, man. All right, the process of water cutting is this process of playing around with dehydration. And so there's not a dose-response relationship here. This is where all the bro science comes from. You know, the common rhetoric when it comes to how much water should you drink for a water cut is like 10 liters a day. Where did that number come from and why? You know, think people give the same advice, 10 liters of water a day, to 140 kilo males and 60 kilo females. Doesn't make any sense. Why would someone who's 1.5 times heavier than someone else receive the same dose? That doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of this bro science. So we've got to understand, what are we trying to achieve with the water load? It's about playing around with homeostasis, your body's natural balance, or just a state of balance, right? Homeostasis with hydration. What we're trying to do is to be saturated, to be completely hydrated for a period of time. Have your body's balance set towards, okay, we are hydrated, we're okay to excrete excess stuff, we're in the process of clearing stuff out. We sit in that space for a while, then we take that away. We take the water intake away. Homeostasis takes a couple of days to achieve, let's say 24 to 72 hours. So in that space where you've removed the water, your body's state of balance is still in the idea of excretion. And so during that time, no water coming in, lots of water coming out, body weight drops. That's all water loading is. It's just this manipulation of water in the body. And so again, it's not a dose-response relationship. All we have to do is be completely saturated. Have your cells completely saturated, be completely hydrated. You cannot be hyperhydrated. You can't be more hydrated than hydrated. So by drinking more water, you're not getting an increased effect. Once you are hydrated, you're hydrated. The point of hydration that we're looking for, essentially a good litmus test, is if you're peeing clear once an hour, you're very hydrated. That's the point that we need to get to. And for most people who drink an average amount of water, you know, between 1 and 3 liters a day, it's probably only going to be 1.5 to 2 times that. So water load for most people is going to be 4 to 6 liters. Not a lot of water. And it's scary if you're used to this whole 10 liters a day mindset to drink this minimalistic amount of water. But all you need to do is be hydrated, and be hydrated all the time for a short period of time. The time that we water load for, again, there's a lot of bro science for it, and there's a lot of common approaches that rely on dose-response relationship. The longer that you water load for, the more water you'll lose. Again, that's completely false. We just need to shift the body's balance. We just need to shift homeostasis towards being hydrated and then shift away from it. Again, homeostasis 24 to 72 hours to achieve. So the water loading process doesn't need to go for much more than 3 days. I would say do it for 5 or 6 for a contingency for any reason. You may also need to play with other electrolytes to affect levels of hydration depending on how much water you need to cut. For example, sodium, potassium, that kind of thing. In which case you might do a sodium load and then remove it, but that's getting pretty complicated now. Having more time to play around with that may be a benefit, may be a tool up your sleeve that can help you with this process. But that's essentially the nuts and bolts of it. We play around with hydration, and it's not that complicated. A little bit of extra water, take that water away a day or two before the weigh-in, voila, you start pissing out heaps of water, you're not drinking any, the scales drop. Then on top of that, there's all the additional strategies to kind of get rid of water. That's where it's getting pretty complex. Doing a very simple water load, just water at the right amount, removing it at the right time, should be enough to get a good 3% of body weight down. So if you're 100 kilos, going to knock 3 kilos off the scale. That's pretty significant. It's only when you start pushing 5% plus that you start to look at these alternative strategies to get water off, which will involve electrolyte manipulation, which may involve strategies at the end to excrete more water, such as, hot baths, saunaing, sweating methods, things like that. There are better and worse methods, but again, I don't want to get too deep into this. The other big question that I wanted to answer today is, of course, how much is okay to cut? And there's no perfect answer to these questions, but if we're talking about 24 hours, 1 to 3%, comfortable. 3 to 6% is getting challenging but very doable, probably reserved for the more experienced. 6 to 8% is getting pretty full on. 6% plus is getting pretty full on, or 7 to 10% is getting absolute extreme. 10% plus is suicide. 10% plus, as a coach, I would disconnect from a client who wants to do a 10% plus weight cut. If they're going to say, I'm going to cut for this competition, I'm probably not going to support it, because to me, the risks are too high, not in terms of performance necessarily, like performance risk is very high, but health. It's not something that I want to be a part of. I wouldn't condone a cut that high. It's just too risky, just too wild, too full on. It's not worth it. The other thing, if you're needing to cut 10% plus, you're just unprepared. You should have been more prepared. You shouldn't have had to cut that much weight. You need to think about, okay, well, if I need to cut this much weight, I'm not ready to do this competition in this weight class. I should do a competition at a later date and manipulate my weight using calories rather than water. Different story in a 2-hour weigh-in, you're going to cut a lot less weight because you've got a lot less time to rehydrate and refeed. So I'd say 1 to 2% is doable and comfortable. 2 to 4% is challenging but still doable. 5% is extreme. 5% plus is suicide for a 2-hour weigh-in, especially in terms of performance. Cutting the weight for a 2-hour weigh-in with a 6%, 7%, not that crazy health-wise, but certainly performance. You're just not going to rehydrate and perform in time with a 2-hour weigh-in doing a cut that big. The tricky thing is that you'll get reports from lifters of like, oh yeah, I did this massive cut and I performed just fine. It's like you perform just fine in the sense that you hit the numbers that you may have wanted to. The question I always ask is, if you went in there healthy and hydrated, would you have performed way better? Would you have done way better because you weren't fucked from the water cut? So there's something to consider if you're used to doing these crazy cuts. Lot more complicated, a lot more to it than that when it comes to cutting weight. The most important part is the rehydration process, and maybe I'll touch on that in another episode. I'm gonna leave it there. Hope that was helpful. If you ever need help with a cut, please feel free to reach out. Rochelle, our nutrition coach, is a weapon when it comes to water cuts. She's just written up a fantastic guide. We're going to make a couple of Instagram posts about this subject as well. Hope that helped. We'll talk to you soon.